this type of background is seen everywhere. You can get similar backgrounds in stock websites, but why should you when you can create your own in Blender for free? So without wasting any time, let's learn how you can customize and create your own perfect looping background of dots. In our default scene, we're going to keep the default cube because that's going to act as our geometry node object. We're going to bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and we'll change it from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we can press new to add in a new geometry node tree. And finally, we can delete the default cube by selecting the group input and tapping X. Then we can press Shift A and search for a grid, which is essentially going to be the basis of our entire animation. We can plug the mesh into the geometry and change the size on the X and Y to something like 10 and increase the vertices to something like 100. Apart from that, we can just press Shift A and search for a subdivide mesh node and plug that in right afterwards. If you switch to wireframe view, you can see how dense the mesh is going to be. We'll keep the level at 0 for now, and before rendering we can hit it up to 1, maybe even 2 if you want to, but most probably 1 itself. Once you have that set, we'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node, plug that in over there, and simply search for an icosphere and plug that into the instance. Now obviously the size of the icospheres are going to be way too large, and we also have wireframe on. We'll switch it from wireframe to solid and reduce the radius of the icosphere down to something like 0.01. And also to make sure that the size makes sense when we have the subdivision on, we have to just increase the subdivision and make sure that the size is not too small or too large. A value of 0.02 seems a bit too large, so I'll keep it at 0.01 itself. Once you have that, we actually have to shift these up and down. And to do that, you could go here and add in another displace modifier. However, that's a process that I used to use in the past, and we have to use the default textures that are available in Blender's textures. So you don't have as much control as if you were to use displacement from the shader nodes. So we'll do everything within geometry nodes itself. So what we have to do is search for a set position node, plug that into the instance on points, and then press Shift A and search for a noise texture. If you want to see me do this using the displacement modifier, you can check out the video on the top right corner over here. However, that's just a time lapse and not really a step-by-step tutorial. Anyway, the noise texture needs a lot more control, so we'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp and plug the color into the factor, and the output of the color ramp has to change the offset of the set position. However, we don't want it to move in all the 3 axes, we want it to move only on one axis. So we'll press Shift A and search for a combine XYZ node and plug the color ramp into just the Z value, and then plug this vector into the offset. Now you see the noise texture move all of these particles up and down in the Z axis. And in fact, if you want to create a volume distribution of points without using a mesh to volume node, then this is one method in which you could create that. However, to get the effect that we're looking for, we'll go ahead and decrease the scale of the noise texture to a really small number. So you can go to something like 0.65 to get this sort of a shape. Now remember, the powerful part of using geometry nodes is that it doesn't have to be a noise texture. It could be a Voronoi texture. You could mix the two together, and I'd suggest you try those out yourself to get different effects that you desire. However, I'm going to be making the most basic version with this noise texture. Now I want the strength to be a little bit more, and for that reason, I'm going to press Shift A and search for a vector math node and change it from add to multiply and plug that right after the combine XYZ node. And then we can just increase the value on the Z axis to get the strength to increase to whatever we want it to be. So now obviously a strength value of 5 is way too much. So I'll reduce the strength to something like 2, and I'll also decrease the scale to 0.4. Now we need to actually get this texture to move and loop. So I'll first decrease the level of the subdivision mesh back to 0, just so that it's easier for the animations to get calculated. And I'll take this noise texture, move it back, and then press Shift D to duplicate it. After that, I'm going to change them both from 3D to 4D, and then I'll press Shift A and search for a mix node. Now I'm going to have to change the type of the mix from float to color, and then plug it in between the noise texture and the color ramp. And for the second value, I'll plug in the second noise texture. Now we'll go ahead and set all of our animation defaults. So we'll go to the output properties here, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, change the end frame to 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation, change the output folder to wherever you want it to be, and of course file format is going to be FFmpeg video. Encoding has to have a container of MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then we can go back to frame 0 and just hover over the W value on the first noise texture and tap I, and then expand the timeline a little bit, go all the way to frame 150 and then change the W value to 2 and then tap I. Apart from that, we'll also select the noise texture, come down here and press T linear to change the interpolation to linear instead of the default Bezier. Then on the second noise texture, we can go ahead and press I while hovering over the W to add in a keyframe at the last frame. Then go back to frame 0, change the W to -2 and then press I, and then go down here, press T linear. Finally, we'll change the factor to 0 when we're at frame 0 and then press I, and then when we're at frame 150 we'll change the value all the way to 1 and then press I. So that way you'll see you have a mesh that moves around and is perfectly looping. Now the motion should be fairly subtle for most background purposes. However, to see the actual speed at which it is moving, we'll change the playback from play every frame to frame dropping. And this might seem too fast for you, it might be too slow, but you can change the speed by either changing the amount that the W went through. So instead of going from 0 to 2 and -2 to 0, you can go from 0 to 1 and -1 to 0. Or you can just take this and grab it by pressing G and moving it to a longer length to just slow the animation down. So maybe 300 and then it becomes a 10-second long animation. However, I'm going to keep it at 5 seconds itself and maybe make changes later on. The next thing that we have to do is make sure that it has a material on it. So we'll go to the end of our geometry node tree and just bring this to the side, press Shift A and search for a set material node as well as a set shade smooth node. So we'll plug both of those in one after the other and just select the default material itself, and that should be it. If you feel like each icosphere requires more geometry, you can always increase the subdivisions over here to make them more round. If you want to see how long the final evaluation is taking, you can switch on overlays and switch on the timings, and that way you get to see exactly how much time it takes for the entire thing to process. So right now it's taking 46 milliseconds, but if I just increase the subdivision on the subdivide mesh to 1, the value increases to 188 milliseconds. Furthermore, if I increase the subdivisions on the icosphere to 3, they become nice and round, but the total time it takes for Blender to calculate this for each frame becomes 226 milliseconds. So you can play around with what you think is best for your scene, and that should be it. Finally, we can start off the actual texturing. So we'll change this from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. And here we can also go up and change the viewport shading to rendered so that we can see what's happening. Apart from that, we can just switch off the light and go to the world properties and change the color all the way to white. Then we can switch off overlays by toggling this button, and this is what we currently have. To actually see the colors better, we'll first place the camera so that we know exactly how much of overlap's happening. So we'll select the camera from the outliner, we'll press Alt-G to clear location, Alt-R to clear rotation, and then press RX90, and then just grab it on the Z to move it up a little bit, and then grab it on the Y to move it back. And remember, you can switch on overlays again and just press 3 on your numpad to go to the side view to just make sure that it's at the start of where your geometry nodes is. So my geometry nodes is starting about here and the camera is placed just above that, so that's all right. So you can clearly see where my camera is and where the geometry nodes is. So then I can press 0 to go into my camera view, go to the camera properties over here, change the focal length maybe down to 50. Of course, this is again your artistic preferences. Change it to 25 and then switch off overlays. And I'm going to rotate it on the X to just point down a little bit, grab it on the Y, and I'll place it somewhere like this. After that, with the cube selected in the materials, you can go ahead and just reduce the base color till you like the contrast. So if you want it to be completely black, you can go ahead and do that. But a tip that I'd give you is that don't keep it complete black or white, which is basically don't keep it on the grayscale. Give it some amount of saturation and hue. So maybe give it a hue of 0.5 and a saturation of 0.2. And generally using any editing software, you'll be able to change the hue to whatever you want. And if you want to reduce the saturation as well, you can do that using any editing software when you're using it. This way, you can make changes based on the project that you're using this in. However, for now, I'm just going to keep it with a saturation of 0 itself. And I'm also going to go to my render properties, go all the way down to color management and change the view transport from filmic to standard. And that way the white actually becomes a real white. Then I'm going to select the camera, go to the camera properties, go to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1. And then I'm going to continue changing the colors to get something that I think will suit for the background of most requirements. So that's actually all there is to creating this animation. The last thing that you have to do is click render animation. So hopefully you learned how to create this particular animation. It's really simple and really fast to do. So the next time you see this in the background of any of your projects, you know how exactly you can create it. And it doesn't even have to be an animation. It could be a still frame for different PPT or other presentations that you might have. I'm sure you'll make the most use of this and you'll use it in creative ways. So until the next video comes out, don't forget to stay creative.